Hello, and thank you for your purchase of a watercolor kit by Emily Marie Watercolors. I'm Emily, and in this tutorial, I'm going to show you how to fill out the practice sheet included in your watercolor kit. Let's get started. Let's start by talking about what you need. First, you'll need to take the practice sheet out of your watercolor kit. You'll also want to find the brush that you'll be using. Next, you'll need some water. I suggest using an old yogurt container or butter container, but a glass will work as well. And I also suggest finding a plate or plastic lid to mix some of your watercolors on. Although this isn't necessary, it is helpful. Lastly, you might want a paper towel or cloth to help with any sort of mistakes or messes. All right, the first thing that I'd like you to do is to swatch your colors. First, you'll need to wet your brush and then wet the color dots at the bottom of your page. Once you have enough color on your brush, you can paint inside the circle associated with that color above. Clean your brush off and continue with the next color. Remember that your practice sheet colors might be different than the colors in this tutorial. Our first practice is with color density. With watercolors, we need to use water to activate our watercolors. The more water we use, the lighter the color is. The less water we use, the more dense or opaque the color is. Choose one color from below, wet your brush, and paint using the least amount of water on the left-hand side. Your color should be nice and dense and dark. You might need to go back to your paint dot and grab more color. As you move to the right, I want you to gradually add a little bit more water. So I'm grabbing some water from my cup and pulling some of that pigment to the right. You should notice that the more water you add to your pigment, the lighter it becomes. Our next technique is called wet on dry. This technique is when you use a wet brush and paint on dry paper. Choose a color below, wet your brush, grab some of the color, and paint any shape that you'd like onto your dry paper. You can switch up colors whenever you'd like, and you can practice any line work. You can practice changing the pressure in your brush, so pressing harder versus pressing softer. And you can also change the amount of water that you use. If I want to add more water, I can use my plate to put some water onto my plate first, and then grab a small amount of pigment. More water and less pigment means a lighter color. The opposite of our wet on dry technique is wet on wet technique. For a wet on wet technique, I'm using a wet brush and painting on paper that's already wet. Step 1 is to wet your paintbrush, then paint a shape in the space below. I'm going to wet about half of this space. Once my paper is wet, then I can choose a color below and drop that color into the water to watch what happens. You'll notice that the color is spreading a lot more than wet on dry technique. Try adding more than one color. You can also vary your brush strokes and see what happens with this technique. It's also considered the wet on wet technique if we mix a background color first before we wet our paper. So I'm wetting my paper using a blue tone, and then I'm going to drop in some different colors on top of that blue tone. Sometimes as artists, while we're painting, we might make mistakes or we might use too much water. When that happens, we can lift some of the pigment off of our paper so that it's not as dark and dense. We can lift using our paintbrush, or we can lift using a paper towel. First, wet your brush, choose a color, and paint a shape. You might want to add a little bit more pigment to make it a little darker. Now we're going to try lifting some of the pigment out of this shape. Wash your brush. Use your paper towel to gently dry your brush. Make sure you're pulling down and not pushing up. With your dry brush, you can then lift the pigment up, dry again, and continue to lift until you get the desired outcome. You can also use your paper towel to lift even more pigment. This is helpful in case you make a mistake. In this sped up clip, I'm showing you how I lift pigment off of a section that's a little too dark for me. This last space is a free space that you can use to practice certain brush strokes or techniques during your projects. Remember that you'll use the color dots on your practice sheet to paint the projects in your kit. So make sure to keep this practice sheet safe until you are done with your projects. There is another video tutorial similar to this one for your kit projects. You can scan the QR code found on the back of your kit to learn how to paint each project step by step. Or use your own colors and do something totally unique. Have fun, painters!